Alright, hello everyone. Welcome back to MTX Chess. Alireza Firouzja stunned the world in 2021, becoming the youngest player to ever reach the rating of 2800 and skyrocketing to the #2 player in the world. He had such a fantastic 2021 that Magnus Carlsen said he wouldn't even play the next challenger in the World Championship unless that challenger was Alireza Firouzja. Even though Firouzja had a fantastic season in 2021, he still has a lot of good players to beat before he earns a spot against Magnus Carlsen at the World Championship match. Today I want to review a game from the 2021 FIDE Grand Swiss between Alireza Firouzja and Fabiano Caruana. Both players will be playing in the 2022 Candidates Tournament later this year. Caruana had the white pieces in this game, and it was Firouzja with the black pieces, and Caruana starts off with e4. After c6, d4, d5, got the classic Caro-Kann defense from Alireza, one of his favorites. e5 from Fabi, bishop f5, h4, just a very common idea, kind of taking the square away in the as white in the Caro-Kann, h5, and bishop d3. What white's doing here is they're offering basically an exchange of light squared bishops, which is something that Firouzja goes for. And after queen takes d3, we get queen a5 check. And there's a couple ways you could block check here. You could play c3, you could play the bishop out. Fabi likes to play knight d2. And after e6 from black, knight e2 from white, and we get knight e7. So what black's doing here with knight e7, the whole reason why black played h5 is to control this g4 square, and then the knight can come to e7 and then bounce up to this really fantastic f5 square. And because this h5 pawn is here, it prevents white from pushing g4 and kind of putting pressure on the knight. So just some normal maneuvering here in the Caro-Kann. And it was here on move 9 that Fabi actually played a move that we've never seen before in this position. So as white in this position, we've seen castles, we've seen, not that knight, but we've seen the knights moving out, we've seen c3 before, but here Fabi played b4. And what do you do here as black? If you may be tempted to take the pawn, the problem is that after like queen takes b4, get rook b1, queen a4, and rook takes b7. And this just gets really kind of nasty for black real quick. So black didn't win a pawn outright because they lose their b pawn. And as black may be tempted to like pick off this a2 pawn right here, so after queen takes a2, then we start getting things like bishop a3, and this queen is starting to get really trapped. For instance, if black tried to continue with their development by like knight d7, white could play knight c1, and now it's like, where do you go with the queen? You got no squares here. You're just going to have to come to this square, and after kingside castles, the rook's going to be bearing down on the queen. Just not a pleasant position for black. So after queen a6, bishop b3 from Fabi. Fabi's not interested in trading queens so early. And after knight f5, knight f3, we get knight d7. And here, white plays a4, just getting ready to expand on that queen side. Queen c4, here Firouzja is trying to trade queens. If you just look at this position, this black queen is not very good, and the white queen is very good. So trying to exchange queens is a good idea for black. After queen c4, I'm sure Fabi considered taking this queen. The problem though is that after takes, I don't know, maybe a move like c3 from white, black's going to have a really nice outpost here with their knight. They're going to play knight b6 and then knight d5 and have a great outpost for the knight. So I think instead of wasting that tempo capturing the queen after queen c4, Fabi elected just to play bishop d2, get some development. After queen takes b3, c takes b3, we get f6 from Firouzja. A very logical move, just challenging the center right away. After castle kingside from white, bishop e7, g3. The idea with g3 for Fabi is that this knight would love to move and get into the game, but it's kind of pinned down in the defense of this h4 pawn. And so g3 defends the pawn, so now this knight becomes a little bit more mobile. After king f7, rook fe1, black plays f takes e5. So the idea here was just basically to simplify in the center. After d takes e5, we get rook ac8. And it's pretty clear kind of what the idea is for Firouzja. Firouzja, in this position, you might be thinking, oh, I'm going to push this pawn. Maybe I'll even double up my rooks, and I'll try and break open here in the center with this pass pawn and this kind of flank pawn. After knight f4, we get d4 from Firouzja. Firouzja kind of pushing the issue. I was a little surprised by the d4 move. I think a better move might have just been rook c7, and then, for instance, after like rook ac1, we get well, we wouldn't get that right away. What we'd probably get is we'd get something like g6 defending this h5 pawn, and then once the h5 pawn is defended, then this rook can get involved, and then we can proceed with this kind of pawn storm. But Firouzja didn't go for any of that, obviously, and he just played d4 right away. Here we get rook ac1 from Fabi, and c5. So now Firouzja is finally kind of pushing his pieces here. And we get knight d5 from Fabi, a really great move from Caruana. And so this knight looks like it's hanging. The problem though is that after, let's say, e takes d5, white's got e6 check, and after king e8, e takes d7, king takes d7, and then knight e5. And where are you going to go? King. If you go king d8, the knight's going to come here and fork you. So that you're not going to do that as black. So after knight e5, maybe you go king back to e8. The problem with this though is that the knight's coming to g6, and now this bishop gets really difficult to defend. So there's two attackers here, right? You got to move the rook because the rook's under attack. So maybe the rook comes. Maybe the rook comes here to g8, but then the bishop's coming in, so you got bishop d5. And even if you try and defend this way, the position is just going to fall apart for black, and there's just too much firepower coming right towards this bishop. So even though, if we go all the way back, even though this knight move looks like you're throwing a knight away, you're really not throwing a knight away at all. So it's a really good move for white. Firouzja decides to c takes b4, and here we get knight takes e7. So we see why that was such a great maneuver for Caruana, and it's because he gets to trade his knight for the dark squared bishop. After knight takes e7, here Fabi was faced with a couple different decisions. He could pick off the b4 pawn, he could pick off the d4 pawn, or he can make a different move. And so if we just take a look at these real quick, picking off the d4 pawn is a little bit problematic because then black gets to shore up this really nice b4 outpost by playing a5. And then this square becomes really weak, the c3 square. There's ideas maybe of the knights kind of bouncing down to that square. And that's something obviously I think Fabi wanted to avoid, allowing black time to shore up this pawn. You could also conceive of a situation where white played something like bishop takes b4, and after, for instance, knight d5, the bishop's coming here with the knight eventually coming in, forking, and maybe winning this pawn. And that's definitely a playable position. I think Fabi played very logically here, and he elected to play knight g5 check. The idea being is that this is a clean fork of the king and pawn. Once the king moves, for instance, king g6, this pawn is pretty weak and it's going to fall. And what that does is it creates a pass pawn for white. So I think when it comes to taking two pawns or making a pass pawn for yourself, I think Fabi made the correct decision to make a pass pawn for himself. After a little intermezzo, rook takes c8, rook takes c8, then we get knight takes c6. And after knight c6 from black, f4, just kind of shoring up that e5 pawn. And we get king f5. This was an interesting maneuver from Firouzja, basically giving up this g7 pawn to make his pieces more active. After knight takes g7, king takes g6, knight back to e6, king f5. We're getting a little bit of repetition here. For instance, if Fabi were to come back to g7, we'd just be dancing back and forth. So Fabi, playing for the win, obviously plays knight g5. And now white, after all that maneuvering, just has these two really nice pass pawns. After knight c5 from Firouzja, getting his knights more active, we get knight f7. Knight f7 threatening knight d6 with a fork on the king and the rook. So obviously black has to move their king. After king e6, we get knight d6, putting the knight on that great outpost, and we get rook g8, putting pressure right here on this g3 pawn. So white responds with king g2. And here Firouzja gets really active with his king, which I love to see. He plays king d5, and just a great move. White playing rook b1. What white has to do here is they really have to shore up this b3 pawn. Why don't you think black just kind of captured this b3 pawn right away? The problem with that is if black played knight takes b3, f5 check, and then the king's coming, and now we can basically push all these guys with tempo. So you just want to avoid getting into a situation where white is just really kind of marching their pawns down your throat as black. So we get king d5. After rook b1 from white, we get knight e4. Knight takes e4. White did not want to give up the bishop here, so they had to capture the knight back. And after king takes e4, rook c1. And after king d3, bishop e1, king e2, and e6 from white. So you can see that Firouzja is just being ferocious with his king, which is really awesome. After d3 here from black, we get f5 from white, basically just shoring up this weak e6 pawn. Two pawns together, especially two pass pawns together, are so powerful, and we'll see later, a little bit later here in this endgame. And so as black here, what do? If you might be tempted to play something like d2. The problem though is after bishop takes d2, king takes d2, white has rook takes c6, and after b takes c6, now it's two pawns versus a rook. This is a classic winning scenario for white. For instance, how are you going to defend this? You know, if you play the rook over, you push the pawn, and if the rook captures, then you queen. If the rook comes this way, you're going to queen anyway as white. So it's just absolutely winning for white. And so if we go back, that's why in this position, it doesn't really make sense to push d2. So black has to get another piece involved. They play knight d4, makes a lot of sense. And this next move for white, it's unclear if Firouzja missed this move, but how do you get out of the situation as white? And there's just one thing you had to realize, and that is that if bishop takes b4, white here is threatening checkmate. So obviously, let's say black played a throwaway move like a6 and moved just completely away from the action. Rook e1 would be checkmate. So nice little tactic there for Fabi, basically picking off a pawn with tempo, which is really nice. So after bishop takes b4, the only way really black can defend this is by playing d2. And after bishop takes d2, king takes d2, white plays rook c5. And so now it may look like white is losing because black has the extra piece, but the reality is that these pawns are so very powerful. After rook e8, rook e5, king d3, we get king f2 from Fabi getting his king involved, always smart to do, and rook e7. Black has got to do something to try and slow down the progression of these pawns. And after g4, h takes g4, king g3, we can see white further getting their king involved. Rook e8, there's really nothing for Firouzja to do, he's just dancing his rook back and forth. After king takes g4, we get knight c6, and we get king f4. And you may be wondering, oh my goodness, why is white giving up their rook? Well, if white gave up their rook, again, we'd be in this two-pawn versus rook situation, and this is just absolutely winning for white. It doesn't even matter if black wanted to get greedy and pick off some extra pawns. Again, white is just going to march these pawns right down black's throat, and there's really nothing that can be done. So, again, two connected passed pawns in the endgame, extremely powerful. So, Firouzja, obviously knowing all this, is not going to take this rook. So after knight e7, we get f6. Knight g6 check, another fork, the king and the rook. But remember, taking the rook is poison. So after king f5, we get knight takes h4, and knight takes h4. After king g5, knight f3, another king rook fork, king f4, knight d4. The problem is you just cannot take the rook. It's just absolutely losing. And after e7, we get knight c6, again attacking the rook, and we get f7 here. It doesn't really matter if you take the rook because white's just going to queen right away. And after rook takes e7, this was Firouzja's kind of last shot at winning. If Fabi had made the mistake of taking, and this wouldn't even have been a mistake, but if Fabi had played rook takes e7, after knight takes e7, Fabi could have blundered by playing pawn f8 queen, and then forking. Black would have this forking maneuver right here, and it would be winning after this. But even in this position right here, white could simply just nullify that by playing king g5, and now there's no way for the knight to maneuver to stop this pawn from queening on f8. But if we go back to this position, it was in this position right here that Fabiano played rook d5 check. And, what do you do? Here's black. You got to move the king, and you lose the tempo, and then the pawn queen. So Alireza Firouzja resigned the game. So this was a really great game, played between two of the world's best players. Fabi came out and just crushed Firouzja in this one. And I think it's interesting because, Firouzja obviously has had an incredible season, an incredible year, and he's an incredible player. And at 18, I'm sure there are tremendous accomplishments in his future. But the reality is it is so hard to consistently win at this high level of chess. And even though Firouzja is a little bit higher rated than everyone else in the candidates tournament that's going to be happening later this year, it is going to be a very difficult road to hoe to beat all of these guys and to make it to the table against world champion Magnus Carlsen. I would love to see Firouzja win because I want to see Magnus play another world championship. But who knows? We'll have to wait and see. I'm sure that Fabi is gearing up to give Alireza some trouble here in the upcoming candidates. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for liking and subscribing. New videos coming every week. You won't want to miss it. I'll see you guys next time.